The hall was filled with candle smoke and whispered cruelty. Women stood on a long wooden platform, lined up in a way that made Zariah Ashbourne's stomach turn, not with nausea, but with something colder. Recognition. She had been brought here because her father had decided she was worth nothing. And in Valden Moor, when a man with power decided something, the world rearranged itself to agree with him. She stood at the very end of the line. Beneath the heavy dark veil that covered her face, her throat, her gloved hands, all of her, she kept her breathing slow and even. She had trained herself to do that over years of standing in rooms where her presence was an embarrassment. The hall full of bidders, the rows of men with money and ambition, the murmur of the crowd. She heard all of it. She processed none of it. Or she had learned that survival lived in stillness. She was the most unwanted woman in a hall full of unwanted women. And then the great doors at the far end opened, and the noise died. Every conversation, every murmur, every whispered comment, every low laugh stopped at the exact same moment, the way sound stops before a storm decides to break. She could not see him through the veil, but she felt him. She felt the change in the air the way you feel a shift in pressure before rain. A subtle, full-body signal that something large and powerful has entered the space you are standing in. Every instinct she had, every quiet survival mechanism she had built over 22 years, said the same thing. Pay attention. She was the most unwanted woman in a hall full of unwanted women. And the most powerful man in the kingdom had just stopped in front of her, and he was about to choose her, and she did not know whether that was rescue or a different kind of ruin. She would find out which one it was, but by then it would already be too late to change her answer. The mating auction of Valden Moor was held twice a year in the great stone hall of the merchant quarter, and it was the kind of institution that sounded almost reasonable from a distance. Women who had no families. Women whose families had abandoned them. Women whose circumstances had narrowed to a single door, and this hall was it. They came here to be matched. That was the official word for it. Matched. As if life were a card game, and all they needed was someone to hold the other half of their pair. Up close, it smelled like candle wax and too much perfume and fear dressed up as hope. There were 7 women on the platform when Zariah was brought out. She counted them without looking. She had spent so long not making eye contact with people that she had developed an almost eerie ability to observe without appearing to. The woman at the far left was older, perhaps 40, with beautiful hands and a jaw that stayed firm no matter how many eyes swept over her. A woman near the center had a scar running from her jaw to her temple and held her chin high like a sword, drawn and waiting. One woman near the right side was visibly pregnant, her eyes fixed somewhere above the heads of the crowd, somewhere that did not include any of the people in this hall. Zariah understood all of them, without a single word passing between them. She understood them because they were all doing some version of the same thing she was doing. Enduring. Then she was placed at the end of the line, and the murmuring started. It started at the back of the hall, moved forward, spread sideways, thickened. She could hear the shape of it, even if she could not catch every word. Veiled. Why is she veiled? What is she hiding? What could be so wrong that even here, even now, she has to hide? The whispers were not kind. They never were. She had grown up surrounded by the particular cruelty of people who felt they were simply speaking the truth. She thought of her father's voice that morning. Lord Varric Ashbourne, standing in the doorway of the small room they had kept her in for the duration of their stay in the merchant quarter, wearing his best coat and his blandest expression. "If no one chooses you by sundown," he had said, "I will send you to the labor houses in the east. They do not care what you look like there. They only care that you can work. He had said it the way you say the weather is going to change. As plain fact, no more personal than a forecast. She had not wept. She had decided years ago that weeping in front of Lord Varric Ashbourne was like giving water to a fire you were trying to put out. It only made things worse. So she stood. She kept her breathing even. She endured the whispers and the long silences between bidders and the auctioneer's voice, growing flatter and more bored with every minute that passed, without a single hand raised for the veiled woman at the end of the line. The other women were chosen, one by one, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Or the scarred woman went to a quiet farmer who nodded at her with something that looked almost like respect. The pregnant woman was chosen by a merchant who could not quite hide his discomfort, but who handed over his coin without argument. The hall thinned. The pool of bidders narrowed. Zariah stood. The afternoon light shifted through the high windows. She calculated the hours until sundown. She calculated the distance to the east. She was building herself a map of what came next, the way she had always built maps, quietly, internally, because the only plans that had ever worked for her were the ones no one knew about. And then the great doors opened. Every person still remaining in the hall turned at once, the way a field of grass bends when wind passes over it, all in the same direction, all at the same moment. The Alpha King Tavian. Stormborn of Valdenmoor walked through the doors. He was tall, dark-haired. He wore no crown. He did not need one. He wore the kind of quiet authority that settled over a room like a change in weather, immediate and undeniable. His face was sharp and certain. His eyes, even from this distance, were striking, the deep, still grey of water in the coldest part of winter. He was not supposed to be here. That was the thought that moved through the hall like a current. Alpha Kings did not attend mating auctions. Alpha Kings had noble daughters and foreign princesses, and women who had trained since childhood for the honor of being chosen by someone exactly like him. There was no reason anyone could see, for Tavian Stormborn to be standing in this particular hall on this particular afternoon. He walked the length of the platform slowly. He passed the older woman. He passed the scarred woman, already chosen. He passed empty spaces where women had stood. He moved without hurrying, and his eyes moved the way a man's eyes move when he is searching for something he already has a picture of in his mind. He stopped in front of Zariah. The silence in the hall became the kind that has weight. He looked at the veil where her face should have been. She could not see his expression, but she felt his attention. It was different from the crowd's attention, which had been a kind of collective dismissal, dressed up as curiosity. His attention was focused, specific. "I'll take the veiled one." His voice was quiet, completely certain. What the voice of a man who had made up his mind before he walked through the door and was now simply informing the room of a decision already made. The hall erupted. Not in words, or not entirely. It erupted in the 1,000 small sounds of shock. Indrawn breath, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of fabric as people turned to their neighbors to confirm what they had just heard. Zariah stood completely still in the center of all of it, and the single thought in her mind was, "This is either the best thing that has ever happened to me, or it is the worst, and I will not know which for a long time." She was right about that. She was brought to a private room off the main hall to meet him directly. He was already there when she entered, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked at the veil where her face was with an expression she could not read. He did not demand she remove it. He did not ask about it. He simply looked at it for a moment, and then lifted his eyes to her posture, to the steadiness of how she held herself. And he said, "I don't need to see you. I need a queen who will give me an heir and cause no trouble. Can you do that?" The labor houses in the east had 3 meals a day, and beds probably. She did not actually know. She had never been east. She lifted her chin beneath the veil and said, "Yes, Your Majesty." Something shifted in his expression. Small, barely visible, but there. "Good. And understand this clearly. I will not love you. I am not capable of it. This is a contract, not a courtship. You will have safety. You will have comfort. You will have a title. In return, or you will ask nothing of my heart." She almost smiled. Neither am I, she thought, capable of trusting anyone enough for that. "I understand," she said aloud. He nodded once, turned to look out the window, and the matter was settled. Neither of them knew yet, could not possibly know, that they had just made the most consequential promise of their lives, and they had made it in the same breath as a promise to feel nothing. The two things couldn't both be true. Something was going to have to give. It just had not happened yet. The marriage contract was signed 3 days later in the formal council chamber of the palace at Valden Moor, and it was one of the stranger experiences of Zariah's life. She had spent 22 years being invisible, but now she sat at a long mahogany table in a room full of some of the most powerful people in the kingdom, and she was still invisible. But differently. Before, she had been invisible because no one wanted to see her. Here, she was invisible because the man across the table kept cutting off anyone who tried to make her smaller. Lord Varric Ashbourne was already seated when they arrived, dressed impeccably, wearing the warm expression he kept for important people and public occasions. Looking at him with the length of the table between them, Zariah felt the familiar cold press of his presence on her chest. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the tired awareness of an old wound that had never fully healed. Tavian's advisors were introduced. Zyron Coldridge, the king's chief counsel, sharp-featured, sharp-tongued, what with the eyes of someone who spent most of his time measuring people and finding them slightly less than expected. And Ilaris Northvale, court historian, whose presence at a contract signing struck everyone as unusual. She was not a legal figure. She was a woman who studied old things, ancient things. Her eyes, when they moved briefly to Zariah, held something Zariah could not interpret. Recognition? No. Something more careful than that. Tavian outlined the terms without preamble. Zariah would keep her veil whenever she chose. She would never be required to remove it in public or private. She would have her own chambers, her own household staff, her own allowance. She would attend 4 formal court functions per year. She would provide an heir. Beyond those things, they would not share a life. They would share a palace, to 2 people moving through the same building without collision. He said it with perfect ease, as if he were describing the layout of a room rather than the structure of a marriage. When Lord Varric began inserting himself into the conversation, perhaps some terms around her cooperative behavior, Tavian didn't raise his voice. He did not even look at Varric fully. He simply turned his gaze in that direction and said, "I was not speaking to you. These terms are between me and my future queen." Varric's practiced smile held. His eyes went flat. Zariah felt something she did not have a name for settle in her chest. It was warm and small, and she did not examine it closely, because it was the kind of feeling that, in her experience, tended to get taken away. She signed the contract. The king signed the contract. They were married before the end of the day, in a brief ceremony that the court's gossips would dissect for months. Her new chambers were larger than the entire floor of her father's house she had been permitted to occupy, She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment after the escort left, turning slowly, taking in the high ceilings and the deep window seats and the fire already burning in the hearth. A knock at the door. An older woman entered, grey-haired, sure-footed, with the kind of face that had made peace with itself somewhere around the age of 40, and had been the better for it. "My name is Arvella," the woman said, not performing cheerfulness, not performing sympathy, just speaking. "I'll be managing your household. If you need anything, you tell me. I don't gossip, I don't judge, oughtn't I make an excellent cup of tea?" For the first time in longer than she could measure, Zariah felt the muscles of her face try to do something that might have become a real smile if she had let it. "Tea would be lovely," she said. She sat on the edge of the bed after Arvella left, and she let herself feel the relief. Just the relief. Just the clean, simple reality that she was warm and fed, and the labour houses in the east were no longer on her horizon. She would take that. She would hold it carefully. She would not ask for more. That evening there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find the king. He stood in the doorway, in less formal clothing than she had yet seen him wear, and he had the air of someone who had decided to check on something and was now slightly uncertain about having decided to do that. That he clasped his hands behind his back. He looked at the veil. "Everything is satisfactory?" he asked. It was a formal question delivered informally, which made it strange and oddly endearing. "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you." He nodded. He did not leave immediately. He looked past her into the room as if verifying its adequacy, and then he reached past her to adjust the latch on the window that was slightly open, and her hand, reaching to steady herself against the frame, brushed the back of his. She pulled back immediately, not from discomfort, but from shock. His skin was cold. Not cool the way skin could be in winter air. Cold in a different way. Deep and settled, like stone that had been in shadow for a long time. She said nothing. He said nothing. He checked the latch, made some brief comment about the wind off the northern ridge, and left. She stood at the closed door for a moment. She filed it away in the mental drawer she kept for things that required more thought than she had immediate time for, and she went to bed. She lay awake for a long time, staring up at the dark canopy above her head. She made 2 lists, the way she always did when circumstances changed. First list, what she knew about Tavian Stormborn. Almost nothing. Second list, what she knew about surviving in a new environment with limited information. That list was considerably longer. That list, she decided, will have to be enough for now. He came to her chambers 4 nights after the wedding, and it was not what she had expected. She had expected something mechanical, efficient, clinical in the way of contracts and arrangements, the heir, the obligation, what the door closing behind him before she had fully processed that he had been there at all. She had braced herself for that. She knew how to be in a room with a man who did not care about her presence. She had grown up in that room. What happened instead was this. He knocked. He waited for her answer, and when she opened the door, he held out a strip of soft black cloth in one hand. She looked at it. "A blindfold," he said. "For me," I thought. He stopped, tried again. "I will not accidentally see what you do not wish to show. Not ever. Not without your permission." The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely, quietly decent, that for a moment she simply could not speak. She stood back and let him in. In the darkness of the room, with the fire banked low and the curtains drawn, and the world outside the window doing what the world always did without caring about anyone in particular, they learned each other slowly. He was careful. He asked rather than assumed every single time in a quiet voice that cost him something. She could tell it cost him something, this particular kind of gentleness, as if he had practiced distance so long that deliberate warmth required effort. He was not cold in the way she had feared. He was cold in his skin, that same deep bone chill she had felt through his hand at the window, but not cold in his attention. His attention was careful, present. When he rose to leave, much later, he paused in the doorway. He did not look back. He said simply, "Thank you." Not for the act, for something else. Something she did not have a word for. She did not sleep for a long time after he left. She lay in the dark and thought about thank you and what it meant coming from a man who seemed to have very precise relationships with words. He came back the following night. Not because the contract required it. The contract did not require it. He came back because, and she would not understand this for weeks, the room she occupied was the only place in the palace where he did not have to be the king. He did not have to be certain or controlled or the answer to everyone's question. He could simply sit and breathe and be uncertain about things, and no one would notice. The first conversation happened accidentally. He mentioned a trade dispute in the northern valleys, thinking out loud, not expecting a response, speaking the way people speak when they have forgotten they are not alone. Zariah, who had spent years invisible in rooms where powerful people talked, who had absorbed more political reality than she had ever been given credit for, said quietly, "The Northern Valley's dispute isn't about the trade route. It's about the well that sits between the two territories. Control the water, and you control the road." He went very still. He turned to look at the veil where her face was with something new in his expression. A careful, focused attention, like a man who has just heard a sound he did not expect. He said, "How do you know that?" And she said, "I listened. For years I was the girl in the corner of the rooms where people forgot to watch their words around me. I heard a great deal." He came back the following night with a question. The night after that, with two. Both the nights began running long, in a way that seemed to surprise him more than it surprised her. She had suspected, from the first moment she saw him in that hall, from the way he chose the woman everyone else refused, that there was something underneath the perfect control, something that needed to be heard as much as it needed to be obeyed. She was right, and she was beginning, very quietly, to be in trouble. One night, alone after he had gone, she stood before the mirror in her chamber. She did something she rarely did. She lifted the veil. She looked at herself. On her brow, sitting just above the center of her forehead, was the mark she had carried since birth. The mark her father had spent her entire life calling a contamination, a shame, evidence of forbidden blood. It was shaped like a star in the moment before it fully opens, at each point curving slightly, and it was silver-white and faintly luminous. Even in the dimness of the room, it gave off its own soft light, as if something beneath her skin was lit from within. It had been brighter lately. She had noticed it the way you notice a sound that has been low for so long you stopped hearing it, and then suddenly it rises, not to loudness, but to unavoidable presence. She replaced the veil. She told herself it meant nothing, but she had noticed something else too. Elaris Northvale, the court historian who had been inexplicably present at the contract signing, had begun appearing in unexpected places. Near the library, near the gardens when Zariah took her morning walks. She never approached, she never spoke. She only watched with an expression that was not quite urgency, and not quite recognition, was but lived somewhere in the narrow space between them. And as Zariah lay down to sleep that night, she allowed herself, for the first time, the private truth she had been carefully not looking at. She was beginning to want him to stay longer. She pressed her palm flat against the mattress in the dark and breathed through it. She was going to need more than survival maps for this. The first formal court function was held on a Saturday evening in the palace's great throne room, and Zariah prepared for it the way she prepared for anything that required controlled exposure to large numbers of people, methodically and with very little room left for feeling. Arvella dressed her in deep blue, a color that had been chosen by someone with taste, not Zariah's father's idea of what she should look like. The gown fell cleanly, and the veil that matched it was lighter than her usual one, almost translucent at the edges, enough that candlelight moved through it in ways she found unexpectedly beautiful. She stood at the top of the stairs and took a breath. "You have survived worse rooms than this," she told herself. "You have survived the man who made you what you are. You can survive the people who have only heard rumors about you." Tavian appeared at her side without fanfare. He offered his arm. She took it, and they descended into the throne room together, and the court of Valdenmoor got its first long look at the veiled queen. The whispers were exactly what she had predicted. She heard them with the particular clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime cataloguing exactly this kind of sound. The careful, practiced cruelty of people in expensive clothing. Though no one has ever seen her face. He chose her from a mating auction. Can you imagine? What can she possibly offer him that a lady of proper standing couldn't? She kept her chin level. She kept her breathing even. She kept her hand light on the king's arm, and her attention moving across the room in slow, steady sweeps. Lord Varric Ashbourne was present. He stood near the east windows with a group of minor lords, wearing his performance of warmth like a well-fitted coat, laughing at something someone said. He did not look at her. She was, in public, exactly what he had always wanted her to be, invisible, theoretical, not quite real. He drifted toward them during the reception, and she watched him come the way you watch something you have tracked for a long time and know exactly how it moves. "There's your Majesty." Varric's bow to Tavian was practiced and perfectly calibrated. "A remarkable evening. The court has been so eager to celebrate your union." "Has it?" Tavian said. Not a question. Varric turned to Zariah with the expression of a man encountering a pleasant stranger. "And you must be settling in. Well, What happened next was small. It was so small that half the room probably did not notice it. Tavian, without looking at Varric, without breaking the smooth surface of the conversation, reached down and took Zariah's hand. He simply held it. His cold, steady fingers wrapped around hers, and he kept talking, some polite, meaningless response to something her father had said, while her hand was held in his, as if it belonged there. Varric's practiced smile did not change. His eyes went flat and still in a way Zariah knew well. It was a way she had been reading since childhood, and the flatness in them was not hurt. It was calculation. He was assessing, the way he always assessed, for what this meant and what to do about it. She pressed nothing back into Tavian's hand. She simply let herself be held. Later, near the evening's end, someone else approached her. Zariah Ashbourne was beautiful in the obvious, declarative way of a woman who had been told since childhood that her beauty was her primary value and had made it her strongest tool. She had Varric's cheekbones and her mother's eyes, and a quality of assurance that usually took decades to build. She was only 3 years older than Zariah, and she had spent most of those years believing exactly what their father had told her. that Zariah was a problem, a consequence, a liability disguised as a person. She stopped in front of Zariah and looked at the veil for a long, measured moment. "I don't understand what he sees in you," she said. It was not said cruelly, exactly. It was said the way Zariah said most things, as a flat observation, almost clinical. "I'm not sure I do either," Zariah said honestly. Zariah blinked. That was not the answer she had been prepared for. Zariah watched something flicker behind those careful eyes, something brief and quickly suppressed, and then the smooth assurance was back in place, and Zariah turned and walked away without another word. But the flicker had been there. Zariah filed it alongside the other things that required more thought than she had time for. That night, she woke at 3 a.m. to a sound she almost could not identify. Then she understood. Tavian was shivering. He was beside her in the dark, and he was shivering the way a man shivers when cold has reached somewhere deeper than skin, a bone-level trembling, quiet but relentless, despite 2 additional blankets and a fire she could feel from across the room. She sat up in the dark and looked at him. His face, in sleep, was different. The careful control was absent. He looked younger. He looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had only set it down for these few hours of sleep. She added more wood to the fire. She pulled the blankets higher. She sat beside him in the warm dark and watched until the shivering slowed and stopped. And then she sat a while longer than that, looking at the frost she could see, barely, gathering like a thin breath of winter on the edges of his collar. She had never seen that happen to a living person before. In the morning, she asked him directly, "How long have you been this cold?" He looked at her for a moment, looked at the veil where her face was, and then he looked away. "It comes and goes," he said. It was not an answer. He knew it was not an answer. She let it pass, but she went to the library that afternoon and she began reading. Quietly, without asking permission, in the way she had always learned things, because no one had ever thought to give her a teacher, and she had built herself an education from borrowed books and overheard conversations, and the patience of someone who understood that knowledge accumulated slowly and was worth every slow hour of it. She was looking for something. She was not yet sure exactly what. It was Alaris North Vale who finally spoke to her. 3 weeks after the court function, on a night when the palace was quiet and the library was lit only by the lamps Zariah had brought herself, the court historian appeared in the doorway. She was carrying a book, old, thick, bound in something that was not quite leather and not quite cloth, with a spine so worn the title was no longer visible. She set it on the table across from Zariah without a word, opened it to a specific page, and pressed her fingertip to an illustration in the center. Then she raised her eyes. Zariah looked at the illustration. It was a crest, an unfurling star shape, each point curving slightly, drawn in silver ink that had not faded in what appeared to be centuries of sitting in this book. Her heart moved in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She knew that shape. She had looked at that shape every time she lifted her veil in private. She had worn that shape on her skin since the day she was born, and she had been told, every single time it was mentioned, that it was a shame, a contamination, evidence of blood that should never have existed. Alaris sat down across from her and spoke, quietly, with the precision of a woman who had been waiting for the right moment to release something she had been carrying for a long time. The crest in the book was called the Velindra mark. It was not a curse. It was not a contamination. It was the seal of the founding bloodline of Valdenmoor, the direct descendants of Queen Velindra herself, the woman who built the first stones of this kingdom 300 years before the Stormborn kings came to power. The Velindra line had been believed extinct for 3 generations. No living heir had been documented. Scholars had argued for decades about whether the bloodline had died with its last known carrier or had continued quietly in secret. The crest on Zariah's brow answered that argument. She was not Lord Varric Ashbourne's embarrassing secret. She was not the disgraced product of a father who despised her. She was the last living heir of the woman who had built the kingdom her husband now ruled. Zariah sat with that for a long moment. Then the second understanding arrived, and it hit harder than the first. If her father had known, and he must have known, you did not hide a mark like this on a child for 22 years without knowing exactly what you were hiding, then everything he had done to her had been deliberate. Not the rage of a man who resented an illegitimate daughter. The deliberate, calculated work of a man who was erasing someone before anyone could discover what she carried. "There's more," Ilaris said, quietly. She placed a second document on the table. Letters, copies of letters, the originals she explained having been traced with great difficulty through correspondences that Varric's allies had not been careful enough to destroy. The letters were between Lord Varric Ashbourne and a man named Draven Shadowwind, a disgraced former lord of the Southern Territories. Zariah read the letters. She read them twice. The young man she had loved, Caelor Grantham, had not died in a mysterious accident. He had not died because of anything she had felt or done or failed to do, but he had died because he had seen the mark on her brow and had recognized it. He had been in the process of going to one of the kingdom's scholars when Varric's men found him. They had killed him to keep him quiet, and Varric had spent the years afterward letting Zariah carry the weight of it, letting her believe, in the hollow shame of grief, that something in her had caused his end. He had known she would blame herself. He had counted on it. Guilt was one of the most efficient forms of control he had ever discovered, and he had applied it to her with the precision of a craftsman. Zariah set the letters down. She did not weep. The grief for Caelor was not new. She had been carrying it for years in the form of a wound she had believed was her own fault, and now the wound was the same weight, but entirely different in its meaning. It did not hurt less. It hurt differently, and under the hurt was something clean and sharp and clarifying, like air after a storm. She was not guilty of Caelor's death. She had never been guilty of anything except being born to the wrong man. She sat with Ilaris in the silent library for a long time, the old book open between them. Then she said, "Does Tavian know?" Ilaris shook her head. Zariah thought about that. She thought about what it would mean for her identity to be known. In court, in the kingdom, in the political landscape that she had been quietly studying for the past weeks. A Velindra heir was not a private matter. A Velindra heir was a claim, a symbol, a potential weapon in the hands of anyone who wanted to use it. She was not ready to hand it to anyone. Not yet, and not even to the man whose nightly visits she had begun looking forward to, with a feeling she had stopped pretending was simply habit. She needed the full picture. She had always survived on full pictures, and incomplete information was how people got hurt. She went back to her room that night and stood before the mirror and lifted the veil and looked at the crest. For the first time in her life, for the very first time, she did not look at it with shame. It was not a contamination. It was not evidence of blood that should not exist. It was a crown, a quiet, silver, ancient crown that no one had ever told her she was allowed to wear. She stood there for a long time, letting that understanding move through her like warmth. The baby came in early spring. Zariah had known, of course, had known for months, or had felt the change in her body and in the palace's attitude toward her, which had shifted in the subtle but unmistakable way that things shift when a queen is carrying an heir. The whispers changed, the looks changed. Even Zyron Coldridge, who regarded Zariah with the professional wariness of a man who assessed every variable, had begun treating her with a careful distance that was its own form of respect. Tavian had been different since he had noticed the change. He had not said anything dramatic about it. He was not a man who dealt in dramatic statements. What he had done instead was appear at her chambers slightly earlier each evening. He had begun asking her, in the same tone he used for everything, matter of fact and quiet, whether she was comfortable, whether she needed anything, whether the fire was high enough. Small things, repeated things. The kind of care that builds itself from accumulated small acts, invisible from any individual moment, but unmistakable in the pattern. The labor was long. She would not remember all of it clearly afterward. She would remember the fire burning too hot and then too low, and Arvella's voice steady in the room like an anchor, and the particular quality of the quiet that descended at the very end when everything held its breath. And then the cry of a newborn child, outraged and healthy, and announcing itself to the world with impressive volume. A girl, Arvella said. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Tavian was brought in. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he crossed the room. Zariah, exhausted and warm and undone in every possible way, watched him look at the small bundle in the nurse's arms, and she watched something in his face, something beneath the careful, controlled surface of him, crack open. Not break. Open. The way a seed opens, quietly and completely, into something it was always going to become. He sat beside the bed. He looked at the baby. He looked at Zariah. Then, in a voice she had never heard from him before, rough at the edges, as if it had traveled a long distance to reach the air, he said, "She's beautiful." Zariah looked at their daughter, and the joy that rose in her chest was enormous and real and full, and underneath it, immediate and insistent, was fear. She had done what the contract required. She had provided the heir, the reason for her presence here, the justification, the practical, logical purpose behind everything, was now complete. Or she had been in rooms where her usefulness ran out before, and she knew exactly what happened after that. The polite withdrawal, the managed distance, the gentle, professional return to the terms of whatever arrangement had put you there in the first place. She felt the tears on her face before she registered that she was crying. Tavian's expression shifted. "What's wrong?" She shook her head. She was trying to find words that were honest, without being pathetic, and finding that the two things were harder to separate than she had expected. "You have what you needed now," she said finally. I understand that things might change, that the contract..." He looked at her for a long moment. The baby made a small sound between them. "Zariah." He said her name the way he said it now, not the formal way of the first weeks, but the way that had developed quietly in their nighttime conversations, the way you say a word you have decided belongs in your vocabulary permanently. "Things are not going to change. You don't have to. I am not saying it because I have to." His voice was steady. His eyes, fixed on the veil where her face was, were absolutely certain. "I am saying it because you are the mother of my daughter. Because you are." He stopped. He looked down at their daughter for a moment. When he looked back up, the control in his face had been set aside entirely. "Because you are everything to me, all of you. The voice in the dark. The woman who understood the water rights dispute when my entire council had missed it for 3 months. The person who adds wood to my fire in the middle of the night and says nothing about it." She went very still, what he knew about that. "I love you," he said. Simply, without performance. As a fact he was stating because it had become impossible not to state it. The words had barely finished when it happened. His hand flew to his chest. The color, not just the warmth, but all color, drained from his face in a matter of seconds. He tried to say something and could not. His body began to shake. When Zariah moved toward him, when she caught his arm, his skin beneath her hands was cold as stone in deep winter. "Tavian." Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "Tavian, look at me." His eyes found her face through the veil, and there was something in them that she recognized with horror, not pain, but a terrible, helpless awareness, as if he knew exactly what was happening and had always known it might. "Get the healers," she called, and the room erupted into motion, and she held him. She held him with both hands and all her weight, as the frost began to appear on his collar, his chest, spreading outward like a tide that had been held back for a very long time and had finally found the moment it had been waiting for. She had never felt this kind of fear before. It was not the fear of the auction hall, or her father's voice, or the prospect of the labor houses. This was different. This was the fear of watching the specific person in the world who had become irreplaceable move away from her, and being unable to stop it. The healers came. They moved quickly. They bent over him with their hands, and their herbs and their urgent, low voices. Zariah stood back, because there was no choice but to stand back, and held the fear very still and breathed through it. The frost on his chest continued to spread. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair beside Tavian's bed and watched the frost move across his chest in slow, terrible increments. And she thought. She had always thought best when fear made other options impossible. Fear stripped away the noise and left only what mattered, and what mattered was this. She loved him, and he was dying, and she had. Somewhere in the weeks of reading, and the conversation with Alaris, and the slow accumulation of information she had been quietly building, a piece of information that might be the only thing that mattered. In the early hours of the morning, when the palace was dark, and the healers had done everything they could, and were now speaking to each other, in the careful, truthful tones of people who have reached the edge of what their skills can offer, Zariah stood. She walked to the council chamber. The council was there, bleary, grim, uncertain. They rose when she entered, and she noted the small, precise hesitation in each of them, the half-second where they calculated what she was and what authority she carried, and she did not give them time to finish the calculation. "I am Queen Regent until the king recovers," she said. "If anyone at this table would like to dispute that, they are welcome to do it in writing and present it to me after I have dealt with the crisis that is currently killing my husband." No one spoke. "I need Alaris Northvale here now. I need a fire lit in the king's chambers large enough to heat the room and kept at that level regardless of cost. And I need someone to send for Nymeria Winterborn from the neighboring kingdom. She is a healer who specializes in bloodline curses. You will find her in the city of Valenbrook. You will bring her as quickly as horses can be ridden." Zyron Coldridge, to his credit, was already writing before she had finished speaking. She walked back to Tavian's chambers, and she sat and she waited. Ilaris arrived first. Then, 2 days later, 2 days in which Zariah barely slept and ate only what Arvella physically brought to her and placed in her hands with the firmness of someone who has decided that caring for someone means occasionally overriding their protests. Nymeria Winterborn arrived. Nymeria was old in the way of people who have decided that age is not an embarrassment, but a credential. She was small and deliberate in her movements. Often she entered the room and went directly to Tavian's bedside without greeting anyone, and she examined him for a long time in silence. Then she stood. She looked at Zariah, and she said, "I need to see the mark." Zariah went still for only a moment. Then she lifted the veil. The silver crest on her brow was brighter than it had ever been, warm and steady, lit from beneath, more luminous than she had seen it, even in the weeks since it had begun to intensify. The whole room seemed to quiet around it. Nymeria looked at it for a long moment. "The cold blood curse," she said, confirming what Zariah had pieced together from the library texts. "Every storm-born king since the 3rd generation. It runs in their blood like a slow river, and for most kings it is only a chill. But when a storm-born king loves fully, completely, without reservation, the curse activates. The deeper the love, the colder the blood, until the heart cannot sustain the cold." "How do I stop it?" Zariah asked. Nymeria looked at the crest again. The curse was placed on the storm-born bloodline by an oracle who was trying to sever the bond between the founding queen's line and the storm-born kings. She placed the curse to make love fatal for every king who followed. A pause. But she also included a cure, perhaps because she believed the Vailindra line was extinct, perhaps because she thought it could never be found. The cure is the freely given touch of a Vailindra heir, given with full intention. The room was very quiet. "You are the cure," Nymeria said. "You have always been." Zariah looked at the king, at the frost on his chest, at the stillness of a face she had come to know in the dark, and in candlelight and in the quiet before dawn, and she felt the full weight of it settle into place. The woman her father had spent 22 years erasing. The bloodline and oracle had spent 3 centuries trying to bury. The cure that had been hiding in a mating auction hall behind a heavy veil, waiting to be chosen by the one man in the kingdom who needed her most. She had a different task to handle first. She called for a horse. Soraya Ashbourne came to the palace that same morning, before Zariah had even sent a summons. She appeared at the gate with a sealed letter in her hands and an expression on her face that Zariah had never seen there before. Not the smooth assurance or the carefully practiced cruelty, but something raw, and something that looked like a woman who had been examining a story she had been told her whole life and had started to notice where the seams did not quite match. "I found this years ago," Soraya said, when they were alone, "in his study. I didn't know what it meant. I kept it because I don't know why I kept it. Something told me to." She held out the letter. It was addressed to Draven Shadowend. It was in their father's handwriting, and it said exactly what the copies Alaris had found also said. But this was not a copy. This was the original, with the seal still intact on the fold, with Varric's signature at the bottom in the particular ink he favored. Zariah took it. She looked at her sister, the woman who had resented her because she had been taught to, who had used cruelty as her inheritance, because it was the only inheritance Varric had thought to leave her, who had kept a letter she could not understand for years, because something in her had known it mattered. "Come with me," Zariah said. They rode to their father's estate together, Zariah and Soraya Ashbourne, with the king's guard behind them, and a sealed letter between them, and 22 years of silence in the air. Lord Varric was in his study when they arrived. He rose when Zariah entered, and his expression did what it always did in unexpected situations. It went to smooth and unreadable, a blank surface he used the way other men used armor. "My dear, I'm not going to call you father," Zariah said. "I don't think we need to pretend anymore." She set the evidence on his desk, the letters, or the documentation Elaris had compiled, the timeline of Kalor Grantham's death and the days before it, the testimony of 3 separate sources who had placed Draven Shadowend in the village where Kalor had died on the night that he died. She watched him look at each piece. She watched him begin to understand that the story he had controlled for 22 years was no longer under his control. He tried to speak. He tried to reframe. He tried to look at Zariah with the expression that had always, until now, worked. The expression of a father who expected his daughter's loyalty as his due. Zariah stepped forward and pressed the original letter into Zariah's hands. "I'm sorry," she said to Zariah, not to Varric, to her sister. "I should have asked questions years ago. I should have asked who told me the things I believed about you, or and why." Lord Varric Ashbourne said nothing to that. There was nothing to say. The King's Guard took him before sundown. Zariah rode back to the palace with Zariah beside her, and neither of them spoke much for most of the journey, because some things require the silence to settle before words are appropriate. But when they reached the palace gates, Zariah looked at Zariah and said, "What do you need?" And Zariah said, "Come inside. I have a husband to save." The room was warm and still when Zariah returned. Tavian's breathing had slowed. The frost had moved further. He was pale as first snow, and she could see the faint blue at his lips, and the sight of it made something in her chest tighten with a fierce, protective love that she was done pretending she did not feel. She sent everyone out. Nymeria, who was watching from the doorway, gave her one brief nod and pulled the door closed. Zariah sat beside him. She reached up and lifted the veil, lifted it off entirely, folded it, set it on the table. The silver crest on her brow was bright enough now that it cast a faint light on the bedclothes. She placed both hands flat on his chest, over his heart, and she felt the cold even through her palms, bone deep and still and terrible. She did not try to control what happened next. She had learned, in 22 years, that the things she had been told to suppress were actually the things she had the most of: feeling and steadiness, and the kind of love that did not ask anything back from you because it was not built on exchange. It was built on choice. She chose him, or she chose the man who had looked at a veiled woman in a hall full of people who refused to look and had said, with complete certainty, that one. She chose him with everything she had, and the silver crest responded. The warmth began in her palms. It spread outward, not a sharp heat, not a burning, but the deep, sustaining warmth of a fire that has been carefully tended and is now at its steadiest point. It moved from her hands into his chest. She felt the resistance. The cold was old and settled, and it did not want to yield, but she held on. She held on the way you hold on to something you are not willing to release, not because you are stronger, but because you have decided, absolutely and completely, that letting go is not an option. The frost began to retreat, slowly, then with increasing speed. It pulled back from his collar, or from the edges of his chest, receding like a tide moving away from shore. The terrible blue at his lips faded. The color returned to his face in small degrees. Not a rush, a gradual warming, like a window slowly filling with morning light. She held on until she felt it, the moment when his heart, beneath her hands, shifted into a steadier rhythm, warm, full, no longer fighting against itself. His eyes opened. They were the same deep winter water grey they had always been. But behind them, for the first time since she had known him, for the first time in his life, she suspected, there was no cold at all. He looked at her face, at the crest on her brow, at her eyes, which she realized, in a distant part of her awareness, he had never truly seen before. He was quiet for a long moment. "You're the one they tried to erase," he said. "Well, not with horror. Not with the kind of shock that makes people need distance. With wonder." The same wonder she had heard in his voice the night their daughter was born, when he had looked at something he had not expected and found himself entirely unprepared for how much it mattered. She felt the last wall between them come down, like something that had been leaning for a long time finally settling to rest. "Yes," she said. He reached up, slowly, still weak, still finding the edges of his own warmth again, and he took her hand from his chest and held it. His skin was warm. For the first time, his skin was warm. She felt that warmth move through her fingers and settle somewhere deep and permanent in her chest. They stayed like that for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already understood. 6 months passed. Spring moved through Valdenmoor in the way spring moves in a place that has had a hard winter, not gently, but with an intention, a decisiveness, as if it had made up its mind and was not interested in being delayed. Things changed in those months. Some changes were formal. Lord Varric Ashbourne's trial was conducted with the full weight of the kingdom's legal structure, and the evidence, gathered carefully, presented precisely, was more than sufficient. Draven Shadowend, faced with the original letters, did what Draven Shadowend had always done, which was to protect himself at the expense of everyone else, and confirmed what the documents had already made clear. Varric was found guilty of conspiracy, of murder, but of the deliberate concealment of a royal bloodline. He was not executed. Zariah had not asked for that, and the decision mattered to her for reasons she did not feel the need to explain to anyone. He was stripped of his title, his lands, his fortune, and sent to the northeast provinces where the winters were long and the anonymity was complete. She had not seen him since the day in his study. She did not miss him. That was not quite the right word. You cannot miss something you never truly had. But she was aware of his absence in the particular way that you are aware when a wound finally closes. Not pain, but a different sensation entirely. The absence of something that has been present for so long that its ending requires adjustment. Zariah Ashbourne took a seat beside Zariah on the newly reformed Royal Council and proved, to the considerable surprise of people who had only ever seen her as their father's creation, that she was unexpectedly good at it. She had her father's precision and none of his cruelty, which turned out to be a remarkable combination in council chambers. She and Zariah were not yet close in the way of sisters who had grown up together, but they were building something, carefully, without pretense, beginning with honesty rather than history, which Zariah thought was probably the right foundation. Elaris Northvale had formally presented her findings on the Valindra bloodline to the full academic council, and the documentation, thorough, cross-referenced, painstakingly verified, had been accepted. The implications were still being worked through, slowly and sometimes contentiously, but the central fact was established. The Valindra line hadn't died. It had been hidden, and it had produced a queen. Zyron Coldridge, who had spent the first months of Zariah's time at court regarding her with the careful wariness of a man unwilling to commit to any assessment before all data was in, had written her a brief, dry, formal note of what she suspected was meant to be an apology for his early skepticism. She had kept it because it made her smile. The curse was gone. Not just from Tavian, from the entire Stormborn bloodline. Nymera Winterborn had confirmed it. The ancient text said as much, had said so all along, buried in language that required someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. When the Vailindra heir broke the curse, it broke completely. What the children born to Stormborn kings after that day would not carry it. They would be warm-blooded and warm-hearted and free of the cold that had killed or driven away love in the Stormborn line for 3 generations. Their daughter, Leora, was 4 months old and already conducting herself with the confident outrage of a person who had significant opinions about the world and expected them to be taken seriously. She had her father's grey eyes, and what Arvella insisted was her mother's chin, and she slept best when held by someone who was warm, which was, Zariah noted, with quiet, private delight, always Tavian. He held his daughter with the careful attention of a man who had discovered something irreplaceable and intended to be very deliberate about not breaking it. On an afternoon in late spring, warm in the particular golden way of spring afternoons that have earned their warmth, Zariah sat in the palace gardens on a stone bench with Leora sleeping in her arms. The fountain nearby was running again after winter repairs. The garden smelled like new grass and something flowering just beyond the south wall. Tavian sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. His arm rested along the back of the bench, and his hand, warm now, still sometimes startlingly warm to her. She had not entirely adjusted to it, rested lightly against her shoulder. He was looking at the fountain. She was looking at their daughter's sleeping face. The afternoon moved around them, easy and golden, and extraordinarily ordinary in the way that the best moments are. Not dramatic, not earned by crisis, just present. "Or I have been thinking," he said, "about something you did." "I do many things. You'll have to be specific." He almost smiled. She could hear it in the slight change in his voice. "You rode to your father's estate when I could not be there to prevent it, with only the guard and Zariah. And I was not informed until afterward. You were unconscious." "I was unconscious, yes." A pause. "I have been thinking about what that means, that you rode toward the thing that had hurt you your entire life, without armor, without hesitation, because it was the right thing to do, and there was no one else who could do it." She looked at the fountain. "You would have done the same." "I would have done it differently," he said. "I would have taken a full guard and 3 legal advisors and a written strategic plan, while you walked in with your sister and the truth." Another pause. "That is considerably braver." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he did not seem to need her to say anything. They stayed like that for a while. Then he looked at her face, fully uncovered in the afternoon light, the crest gleaming softly on her brow, her eyes on their daughter. And he said, in a voice that carried everything, "I should have looked sooner." She turned to him. She met his eyes. She had been doing that for months now, looking at him directly, letting herself be seen, finding that being fully seen was not destruction, but something else entirely. Something she had never had a word for, because she had never experienced it. "No," she said. "You looked exactly when you were supposed to." He held her gaze for a moment, and then, because he was Tavian Stormborn, and grand gestures were not his language. He simply turned his face back to the garden. But his hand moved from the back of the bench to her shoulder, and it stayed there, warm and steady and present, and she leaned into it just slightly, and Leora slept between them, and the afternoon held them all. This was not how Zariah Ashbourne had imagined her life when she stood on that auction platform in a heavy veil, counting the hours until sundown, and building mental maps of every exit. She had not dared imagine a life like this one. She had not been given the materials for that kind of imagination. But she had always been good at building things from what was available, and what was available now, this warm afternoon, this sleeping daughter, as this man whose cold hands had been the first mystery she had thought worth solving, was more than she had ever asked for, and exactly what she had always deserved. She pulled the blanket more securely around Leora, and felt the sun on her face, and let herself, completely and without reservation, be here. Zariah Ashbourne, Queen of Volden Moor, the last heir of a bloodline an oracle had tried to bury, the girl no one had wanted by everyone who mattered.